Okay. So I want to come back to something that we started with last time, but to try to really clarify it in terms of this question of what happens when Purim falls on Shabbos. So we'll start with the Gemara in Megillah at the top of the page. This is Gemara in Megillah Daf Daled. When Purim falls on Shabbos, he uses a phrase that we have in other contexts that we ask and explicate, which seems to be, again, we could spend maybe 50 minutes just trying to define that. But let's leave it for now that we talk about the Torah aspects of the nature of the day, right? So Rishon ben Levi says when Purim falls on Shabbos, that is what we do. Now, what's interesting, and this is really what we're going to try to work out, this could be read as prescriptive. This is what you are supposed to or obligated to do when Purim falls on Shabbos, right? Or it could be read as you are allowed to do this on when Purim falls on Shabbos, right? We'll kind of leave that to the side for the moment. And then the Gemara asks what seems to be the following question. My area Purim, why does he say this about Purim? Now again, we'll come back to that. I feel Yom Tov Nami. He says this is true with every Yom Tov. And this is a fundamental halakha about Yom Tov. Titania. Moshe Tikkun Lem LiYisrael. Shivshon v'dorsh b'nyon shel yom hilchos Pesach b'Pesach hilchos Atzeres b'Atzeres hilchos Chag b'Chag. He says that Moshe, we have a brayso that says that Moshe instituted for the Jewish people. In other words, this is a bedrock assumption about Yom Tov, that part of the Yom Tov experience is that we are supposed to be engaged in this process of learning about the Yom Tov on the Yom Tov. Right? Again, the Yom Tov is not only an experiential experience. Sorry, I should come up with a better word for that. But that's a question of I have obligations for the day. That there is a, let's call it a cerebral or a learning component that is part of Yom Tov from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. So what's the Gemara's question? What is Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi telling us about Purim specifically? Right, this idea is something which is true when it comes to every Yom Tov. So the Gemara answers, Purim itzri chalei, ma'udatema nigzor mishum derabba. He says you have to say it about Purim. Now that it does not go without saying, because Purim is different than the other Yom Tovim. Why? He says, because on Purim you might think that we shouldn't be engaged in Shoalin V'Dorshin, let's assume on the Shabbos of Purim. Why? For the same reason that we don't read the Megillah on Purim. Why don't we read the Megillah on Purim?
It's your word. That's how you're going to take it to an expert.
Okay, the concern that you're going to carry, right? Mm-hmm. So you might think that precludes Shoalin V'Dorshin as well. Right? It has to preclude Shoalin V'Dorshin. The assumption of the challenge, right, is that Shoalin V'Dorshin maybe would also involve using a Megillah, right? And there's the idea that let's imagine what does Shoalin V'Dorshin mean, right? And there's the idea that people, let's call it, there's a public drasha about Purim, right? That maybe would necessitate a Megillah. Therefore, right, it comes to tell us that that this basic holiday-related activity is allowed to be done even on the Shabbos of Purim. Right? That's, again, we're still filling in some words of the Gemara, right? As often is the case, the Gemara is terse and not 100% clear, right? But that seems to be the most straightforward way of reading the Gemara. So Rashi says, on this phrase of Shoalin V'Dorshin, he says, Ma'amidin Turgaman Livnei HaChacham L'drosh Igeres Purim Barabim. Right? The way that he fills in the gaps in the Gemara, he says that this process of Shoalin V'Dorshin for Purim, right, would include right? Having someone, a combination of having a translator and someone who will facilitate the explaining of the halacha, right? And what they're doing is darshaning, as it were, out of the Megillah, right? And he specifies Igeres Purim, right? The letter of Purim. What's the letter of Purim? That's the Megillah, right? And again, there's Ravan that I said here, who really spells this out. Lo chashina dilma nofik b'Megillah l'sharabim v'azil l'suye. He says we don't have to be concerned that he's going to take the Megillah out in public. So let's again play this forward. So what's the difference? The mitzvah of Mikra Megillah, of reading Megillah, devolves on the individual, right? Because every individual has to hear Megillah Esther, right? And today, right, there are certainly many places, right, where within a household that multiple people will be reading Megillah in their homes for members of the household. They'll go over to somebody who's sick, somebody who can't make it to shul, whatever it is, to read the Megillah. Right? There are Megillahs that are not used under the control, right, of some kind of, let's call it, it's maybe a little bit overblown, right, but it's not under the control of a central authority, right? Shol and V'darshan does not mean that every person, right, theoretically has to do this process themselves, right? Certainly the way that Rashi is describing it, right, where there's a public shiur, a public sermon that's being given. So he says, notwithstanding the fact there is, in fact, a Megillah perhaps involved, right? There's someone who's reading the parts of the Megillah. That kind of much more top-down activity is, in fact, allowed and acceptable on the Shabbos of Purim. Fine. And it seems like it's much more a question of permission. It is that you are allowed to do this. You might think that this is also, right? This activity, which again, and it is interesting that it is, this is not actually quoted in the Shulchan Aruch as an obligation of the Shabbos Purim, right? That's actually an interesting question. Are you actually, in other words, if you were to go to Yerushalayim in 3 weeks, right, for Shushan Purim on Shabbos, right, the question is, will something like this happen, right? Or, fine. The Rambam reads this halacha differently. The Rambam says, Shalom v'darshan b'ilchos Purim b'osa Shabbos, k'dei la'askir shu Purim. He says, the Rambam says that we ask questions about Hilchos Purim on that Shabbos in order to verbalize or to remind that that day is in fact Purim. Right? Now, what's interesting about the Rambam, first of all, is the Rambam adds the word Hilchos Purim. Right? Again, the way that Rashi read this, what is being described here? Some kind of a public shiur about
Megillah.
Right. Certainly he sees the Megillah as a critical piece, right, of whatever Shalom and V'darshan would mean in a Purim context, right? And that, again, that is supported by the fact that the Gemara seems to say, you might think, just like you don't read the Megillah, you can't do Shalom and V'darshan. Yeah, you with me? Everybody? Mm-hmm. Right? But no, that you're allowed to do. That you're allowed to do. So Rashi, right, needs there to be Megillah present, right, in order to understand the Gemara. So the sermon is a more general sermon. What's interesting, the question, if you remember, the Gemara asked the question of Yeshua and Levi's initial statement. What was the question? Why are you telling me about this Purim? I have to do this on every Yontif, right? But if you look very carefully, what does it say when it quotes the Brisa about the Yontif? It says, Hilchos Pesach b'Pesach, Hilchos Atzeres b'Atzeres, Hilchos Sukkos B'Sukkos. What are you speaking about? Right? In other words, the Gemara quotes this other source about Yontif that talks about ostensibly the same idea. There, what's the drasha about?
Biblical holidays.
It's not biblical holidays, but what about them?
Halachas.
Right. There it specifies that it's about halacha. Right? So the Rambam assumes, right, that when Rabbi Shimon Levi said, Shalom v'darshim b'inyan shal yom, it means what it meant in the context of the other Yom Tovim. Right? It doesn't say Shalom v'darshin, Behilchos Pesach, right? So first of all, again, it doesn't say anything that there's an obligation, right, to talk about the stories, right, on those Yom Tovim. What are you talking about? What are the halachic obligations of that day, right? It's a sheer in, or it's a back and forth, perhaps, right, on halachic topics. And the Rambam says, right, that in order to understand the in order to understand the equation between the two better, right, that what you talk about, right, is actually Hilchos Purim. Right, you're talking about halachas of Purim. And the reason that you do it, right, and it is in order to mention that it is Purim. And the Lechem Mishnah, who actually disagrees with this, says, Milashon Rabbeinu mashma, D'mishum dehu nidcha, v'karu ha-megillah esmo, v'yishkechu shehu hayom hu Purim. He says that what's going to happen, that the Rambam seems to understand the Gemara is saying, because you didn't read the Megillah today, right? Today is the 14th of Adar, the 15th of Adar in Yerushalayim, right? Whatever it is. But I read the Megillah yesterday. So today is actual Purim, right? And maybe I'm going to forget that it is Purim, right? Because normally, right, what's Purim? Purim, I have a Megillah, right? So I have to do something to remember that it is Purim. So the question is why? Why is it important to remember that it's Purim? And what does it mean to remember that it's Purim? Or not to forget that it's Purim?
We celebrated it the day before.
Well, first, yeah.
Have we created some, just like we could bring we could change certain things. We could start Shabbos early. When we decide not to read the Megillah, and hence celebrate Purim on the 14th, have we taken away everything from the 14th? In other words, it's as if it never was the 14th.
So it sounds like it's this understanding. So that's a very good question. It is not dealt with explicitly in the earliest sources, right? And before we get to that, and that's a good question. And there are other questions in terms of, we have a Kriyas Torah on Shabbos Purim, right? In fact, that's when the Kriyas Torah of Purim happens, is on the Shabbos of Purim. So the question is, for the Rambam, is that insufficient? Right? In other words, what does it mean, Lahazkir Shu Purim? Right? If there's going to be laning anyways, right? And and maybe it's not, right? Maybe laning is not sufficient, right? Maybe there is this idea that there is a need to deal with this halachic analysis of Purim. But before we even get to that, there's another question on this understanding of the Rambam, which the Rambam, I believe, does not explicitly deal with. What about the other aspects of Purim, right? We haven't gotten to them yet. What about the Purim Suda, right? Is that not happening on Shabbos? And why not? Right? In other words, that if there really is a Purim Suda on Shabbos, right, does the Rambam's concern make any sense? Right? And are you going to forget? And maybe that's evidence, at the very least, about what the Rambam thought. What happens to Purim, right, when you take the Megillah out of it, right? What happens the day of Purim itself? We don't necessarily have have a question. Have an easy answer to that question. Fine. So I want to bring two last sources to your attention. On the other side of the plate, one is the Tosos. Very interesting Tosos in Megillah. He says, "B'chol ein sarich." He said that there is no need to do this Shoel and Vidorshim thing on a regular Purim. Why? And again, this is very much like Rashi. He says that Shari Korin HaMegillah Utzvei Ika Pirsumei Nisa. Right? He says because we read the Megillah, and that's enough Pirsumei Nisa. That's enough publicizing the miracle. So this brings in another element, right? Maybe not, right? That there is a need to do Pirsumei Nisa, right? As there's a need to proclaim the miracle on Purim. We can't do it through the normal means of reading the Megillah. So the substitute is Shoel and Vidorshin, right? So the question is, however we define Shoel and Vidorshin, right? We see three possibilities. Either that this is a makeup for the Megillah, right? In other words, we can't read the Megillah. That it is somehow a reminder of the missing Purim, right? And again, could you say the Rambam when he says Lahazkir Shu Purim, right? Lahazkir actually means, it's not the same as to remember. Lahazkir is actually to mention, right? To make it clear that it's Purim. And that could be along the lines of Tosos, right? There's a need to do something definitive, right? In order to do Pirsumei Nisa, right? You can't use the Megillah for technical Shabbos reasons, but you do it in a different way. Or you have the possibility raised by Rashi that sounds like this is something that a good Jew should do on every Purim, right? But on Shabbos, you might have thought you weren't allowed to do it at all, right? So the Gemara has to come and give you a specific limud to say that this is exempted, right? It's not under the category, right? And the question, and again, I've seen things in multiple directions, is, as I said before, in Yerushalayim this year, should this be done or not? And that leads us to the question of, all the Gemara says definitively, right? And we mentioned this last time, is that you don't read the Megillah when Purim is on Shabbos. And we saw, and the Ran very much makes this point, that Matanos Avionim is seen to be organically connected to the Megillah, right? The day of reading the Megillah, again, it's cheating the poor to do it on a different day. And again, Rabbi Yosef seems to indicate that's the whole reason we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos, right? Because how can we read the Megillah without giving stuck at the same time? So those we know are linked. But there still is the question of the Purim Suda, right? And there's what happens to the Purim Suda, and that's where we will pick up Mirz Hashem next week. Yeah.
We say that, some say, that Hallel, you don't need Hallel on Purim because of Megillah.
Yeah.
So could you switch it up and
that right. So that's actually, that's an interesting question of, would there be some kind of that? So the Meiri has this theory that if you don't have a Megillah, right? Forget Shabbos. If you don't have a Megillah, then you have to say Hallel, right, as the makeup for the Megillah. So the question is that something that maybe could be a factor? And the difference is, right here there was a Megillah, it just wasn't on the right day, right? But it's a very interesting idea. All right, Mirz Hashem, we pick up next week.
Give me right. Chili. I'll take that.